Author's Preface. And as this was my design in the following work, I have left its primitive form entire, and made it my principal business to correct, improve, and augment it in such a manner, as to render it more instructive and entertaining to the reader. Mention and compared with each other the various authors to whose testimony I appeal, having formed a resolution of trusting to no authority inferior to that of the original sources of historical truth. The Foundation. These accessions to ecclesiastical history could not be exhibited with the same brevity which I have observed in treating other subjects that have already been amply enlarged upon by others. For this would have been incompatible with the information of the curious, who would have received but imperfect and confused notions of these subjects, and would have made me, perhaps, pass for a fabulous writer who advanced novelties without mentioning either my guides or my authorities. I have, therefore, not only explained all those points of history which carry with them an appearance of novelty, or recede considerably from the notions commonly received, but have also confirmed them by a sufficient number of observations and testimonies to establish their credibility on a solid foundation. The illustrations and enlargements, which, generally speaking, carry an air of disproportion and superfluity and an historical abridgment, were absolutely necessary in the present case. Those, therefore, who are prevented from applying themselves to a regular study of ecclesiastical history through want of leisure, or by not having at hand the sources of instruction, and are nevertheless desirous of acquiring a distinct knowledge of certain events, doctrines, or religious rites, may consult the following work, in which they will find the information they want. And those who are inclined to push their inquiries still further will see the course they must pursue, and the authors mentioned whom it will be proper for them to peruse. It would betray an unpardonable presumption in me to imagine that in a work whose plan is so extensive and whose contents are so various, I have never fallen into any mistakes or let anything drop from my pen which stands in need of correction. But as I am conscious to myself of having conducted this undertaking with the most upright intentions, and of having employed all those means that are generally looked upon as the best preservatives against the seduction of error, I would hope that the mistakes I may have committed are neither so frequent nor so momentous as to be productive of any pernicious effects. I might add more. But nothing more is necessary to enable those to judge of this work who judge with knowledge, impartiality, and candor. I therefore conclude by offering the just tribute of my gratitude to Almighty God, who amidst the infirmities of my advanced years and other pressures under which I have labored, has supplied me with strength to bring this difficult work to a conclusion. Oettingen, March 23, 1755. Introduction. The ecclesiastical history is a clear and faithful narration of the transactions, revolutions, and events that relate to that large community which bears the name of Jesus Christ and is vulgarly known under the denomination of the Church. It comprehends both the external and internal condition of this community, and so connects each event with the causes from which it proceeds, and the instruments which have been concerned in its production, that the attentive reader may be led to observe the displays of providential wisdom and goodness in the preservation of the Church, and thus find his piety improved, as well as his knowledge. The Church, founded by the ministry and death of Christ, cannot be represented with more perspicuity and propriety than under the notion of a society subjected to a lawful dominion and governed by certain laws and institutions, mostly of a moral and spiritual tendency. To such a society many external events must happen, which will advance or oppose its interests and accelerate or retard its progress towards perfection, in consequence of its unavoidable connection with the course and revolutions of human affairs. Moreover, as nothing is stable and uniform where the imperfections of humanity take place, this religious society, beside the vicissitudes to which it must be exposed from the influence of external events, must be liable to various changes in its internal constitution. In this view of things then it appears that the history of the Church, like that of the state, may be divided, with propriety, into two general branches, which we may call its external and internal history. 3. The external history of the Church comprehends all the changes, vicissitudes, and events that have diversified the external state and condition of this sacred community. And as all public societies have their periods of luster and decay, and are exposed to revolutions both of a happy and calamitous nature, so this first branch of ecclesiastical history may be subdivided into two, comprehending respectively the prosperous and calamitous events that have happened to the Church. IV. The prosperous events that have contributed to extend the limits or to augment the influence of the Christian Church have proceeded either from its rulers and leaders or from the subordinate members of this great community. Under the former class, we rank its public rulers, such as princes, magistrates, and pontiffs, who, by their authority and laws, their liberality, and even their arms, have maintained its cause and extended its borders. As also its more private leaders, its learned and pious doctors, whose wise counsels, pious exploits, eminent examples, and distinguished abilities have contributed most to promote its true prosperity and luster. Under the latter class, we may comprehend the advantages which the cause of Christianity has derived from the active faith, the invincible constancy, the fervent piety, and extensive charity of its genuine professors, who, by the attractive luster of these amiable virtues, have led many into the way of truth and engaged them to submit themselves to the empire of the Messiah. Under the calamitous events that have happened to the Church may be comprehended the injuries it has received from the vices and passions of its friends and the bitter opposition and insidious stratagems of its enemies. The professors of Christianity, and more especially the doctors and rulers of the Church, have done unspeakable detriment to the cause of religion by their ignorance and sloth, their luxury and ambition, their uncharitable zeal, animosities and contentions, of which many shocking examples will be exhibited in the course of this history. Christianity had public enemies to encounter, even princes and magistrates, who opposed its progress by penal laws and bloodthirsty persecution. It had also private and inveterate adversaries in a certain set of philosophers, or rather sophists, who, enslaved to superstition or abandoned to atheism, endeavored to blast the rising church by their perfidious accusations and their virulent writings. Such then are the events that are exhibited to our view in the external history of the church. Its internal history comprehends the changes and vicissitudes that have happened in its inward constitution, in that system of discipline and doctrine by which it stands distinguished from all other religious societies. This branch may be properly termed the history of the Christian religion. The causes of these internal changes are to be sought for principally in the conduct and measures of those who have presided and borne rule in the Church. It has been too frequently their practice to interpret the truths and precepts of religion in a manner accommodated to their particular systems, nay, to their private interest. And, as they have in some implicit obedience, they have met with warm opposition from others. Hence have proceeded theological broils and civil commotions, in which the cause of religion has often been defended at the expense both of justice and humanity. All these things must be observed with the strictest attention by an ecclesiastical historian. The first thing, therefore, that should be naturally treated in the internal history of the Church is the history of its ministers, rulers, and form of government. When we look back to the commencement of the Christian Church, we find its government administered jointly by the pastors and the people. But, in process of time, the scene changes, and we see these pastors affecting an air of preeminence and superiority, trampling upon the rights and privileges of the community, and assuming to themselves a supreme authority both in civil and religious matters. This invasion of the rights of the people was at length carried to such a height that a single man administered, or at least pretended a right to administer, the affairs of the whole church with an unlimited sway. Among the doctors of these early times, there were some who acquired, by their learned labors, a shining reputation and an universal influence. They were regarded as oracles. Their decisions were handed down to posterity as sacred rules of faith and practice. And they thus deserve to be mentioned, with particular distinction, among the governors of the church, though no part of its public administration was actually in their hands. After giving an account of the rulers and doctors of the church, the ecclesiastical historian proceeds to exhibit a view of the laws that are peculiar to this sacred community, that form, as it were, its center of union, and distinguish it from all other religious societies. These laws are of two kinds. The first are properly called divine, because they are immediately enacted by God himself, and are contained in those sacred books, which carry the most striking marks of a divine origin. They consist of those doctrines that are the objects of faith and reason, and those precepts that are addressed to the heart and the affections. To the second kind belong those laws that are merely of human institution, and derive their authority only from the injunctions of the rulers of the church. The human laws, that constitute a part of ecclesiastical government, consist in precepts concerning the external worship of the deity, and in certain rites, either confirmed by custom, or introduced by positive and express authority. Rites and ceremonies regard religion either directly or indirectly. By the former, we understand those that are used in the immediate worship of the Supreme Being, whether in public or in private. By the latter, such pious and decent institutions as, beside direct acts of worship, have obtained in the Church. This part of sacred history is of a vast extent, both on account of the great diversity of these ceremonies, and the frequent changes and modifications through which they have passed. This consideration will justify our treating them with brevity, in a work which is only designed as a compendious view of ecclesiastical history. As bodies politic are sometimes distracted with wars and seditions, so has the Christian Church, though designed to be the mansion of ch. After thus considering what constitutes the matter of ecclesiastical history, it will be proper to bestow a few thoughts on the manner of treating it, as this is a point of too much importance not to deserve a moment's attention. And here we may observe that in order to render both the external and internal history of the Church truly interesting and useful, it is absolutely necessary to trace effects to their causes and to connect events with the circumstances, views, principles, and instruments that have contributed to their existence. A bare recital of facts can at best but enrich the memory and furnish a certain degree of amusement. But the historian, who enters into the secret springs that direct the course of outward events and views things in their various relations, connections, and tendencies, gives thus a proper exercise to the judgment of the reader and administers on many occasions the most useful lessons of wisdom and prudence. It is true, a high degree of caution is to be observed here, lest, in disclosing the secret springs of public events, we substitute imaginary causes in the place of real and attribute the actions of men to principles they never professed. In order to discover the secret causes of public events, some general succors are to be derived from the history of the times in which they happened and the testimonies of the authors by whom they are recorded. But beside these, a considerable acquaintance with human nature, founded on long observation and experience, is singularly useful in researches of this kind. The historian, who has acquired a competent knowledge of the views that occupy the generality of men, who has studied a great variety of characters and attentively observed the force and violence of human passions, together with the infirmities and contradictions they produce in the conduct of life, will find, in this knowledge, a key to the secret reasons and motives which gave rise to many of the most important events of ancient times. A knowledge also of the manners and opinions of the persons concerned in the events that are related will contribute much to lead us to the true origin of things. Ziv. There are, however, beside these general views, particular considerations, which will assist us still further in tracing up to their true causes the various events of sacred history. We must, for example, in the external history of the Church, attend carefully to two things. First, to the political state of those kingdoms and nations in which the Christian religion has been embraced or rejected. And secondly, to their religious state, i.e. the opinions they have entertained concerning the divine nature and the worship that is to be addressed to him. For we shall then perceive, with more certainty and less difficulty, the reasons of the different reception Christianity has met with in different nations, when we are acquainted with the respective forms of civil government, the political maxims, and the public forms of religion that prevailed in those countries and in those periods of time in which the gospel received encouragement or met with opposition. XV. With respect to the internal history of the Church, nothing is more adapted to lay open to view the hidden springs of its various changes than an acquaintance with the history of learning and philosophy in the times of old. For it is certain that human learning and philosophy have, in all times, pretended to modify the doctrines of Christianity. And that these pretensions have extended further than belongs to the province of philosophy on the one hand, or is consistent with the purity and simplicity of the gospel on the other. It may also be observed that a knowledge of the forms of civil government and of the superstitious rites and institutions of ancient times is not only useful, as we remarked above, to illustrate several things in the external history of the Church, but also to render a satisfactory account of its internal variations, both in point of doctrine and worship. For the genius of human laws and the maxims of civil rulers have undoubtedly had a great influence in forming the constitution of the Church. And even its spiritual leaders have, in too many instances, from an ill-judged prudence, modeled its discipline and worship after the ancient superstitions. XVI. We cannot be at any loss to know the sources from whence this important knowledge is to be derived. The best writers of every age, who make mention of ecclesiastical affairs, and particularly those who were contemporary with the events they relate, are to be carefully consulted. Since it is from credible testimonies and respectable authorities that history derives a solid and permanent foundation. Our esteem for those writers who may be considered as the sources of historical knowledge ought not however to lead us to treat with neglect the historians and annalists who have already made use of those original records. Since it betrays a foolish sort of vanity to reject the advantages that may be derived from the succors and labors of those who have preceded us in their endeavors to cast light upon matters that have been for many ages covered with obscurity. XVII. From all this we shall easily discern the qualifications that are essential to a good writer of ecclesiastical history. His knowledge of human affairs must be considerable and his learning extensive. He must be endowed with a spirit of observation and sagacity, a habit of reasoning with evidence and facility, a faithful memory, and a judgment matured by experience and strengthened by exercise. Such are the intellectual endowments that are required in the character of a good historian. And the moral qualities that are necessary to complete it are a persevering and inflexible attachment to truth and virtue, a freedom from the servitude of prejudice and passion, and a laborious and patient turn of mind. 6. It is well known nevertheless how far ecclesiastical historians, in all ages, have departed from these rules and from others of equal evidence and importance. For not to mention those who lay claim to a high rank among the writers of history in consequence of a happy memory, loaded with an ample heap of materials, nor those whose pens are rather guided by sordid views of interest than by a generous love of truth, it is but too evident how few in number the unprejudiced and impartial historians are, whom neither the influence of the sect to which they belong, nor the venerable and imposing names of antiquity, nor the spirit of the times and the torrent of prevailing opinion, can turn aside from the obstinate pursuit of truth alone. In the pres. Age, more especially, the spirit of the times and the influence of predominant opinions have gained with many an incredible ascendant. Hence we find frequently in the writings even of learned men such wretched arguments as these. Such an opinion is true. Therefore it must of necessity have been adopted by the primitive Christians. Christ has commanded us to live in such a manner. Therefore it is undoubtedly certain that the Christians of ancienty. XXII. As the history of the church is external or internal, so the manner of treating it must be suited to that division. As to the first, when the narration is long and the thread of the history runs through a great number of ages, it is proper to divide it into certain periods, which will give the reader time to breathe, assist memory, and also introduce a certain method and order into the work. In the following history the usual division into centuries is adopted preferably to all others, because most generally liked. Though it be attended with difficulties and inconveniences. XXIII. A considerable part of these inconveniences will be however removed if, beside this smaller division into centuries, we adopt a larger one and divide the space of time that elapsed between the birth of Christ and our days into certain grand periods that are distinguished by sign. Revolutions are remarkable events. It is on this account that we have judged it expedient to comprehend the following history in 4 books that will take in 4 remarkable periods. The first will be employed in exhibiting the state and vicissitudes of the Christian Church from its commencement to the time of Constantine the Great. The second will comprehend the period that extends from the reign of Constantine to that of Charlemagne, which produced such a remarkable change in the face of Europe. The third will contain the history of the Church from the time of Charlemagne to the memorable period when Luther arose in Germany to oppose the tyranny of Rome and to deliver divine truth from the darkness that covered it. And the fourth will carry down the same history from the rise of Luther to the present times. XXIV. We have seen above that the sphere of ecclesiastical history is extensive, that it comprehends a great variety of objects and embraces political as well as religious matters, so far as the former are related to the latter, either as causes or effects. But however great the diversity of these objects may be, they are closely connected. And it is the particular business of an ecclesiastical historian to observe a method that will show this connection in the most conspicuous point of view and form into one regular whole a variety of parts that seem heterogeneous and discordant. Different writers have followed here different methods according to the diversity of their views and their peculiar manner of thinking. The order I have observed will be seen above in that part of this introduction which treats of the subject matter of ecclesiastical history. The mention of it is therefore omitted here to avoid unnecessary repetitions. Book I. Containing the history of the Christian Church from its first rise to the time of Constantine the Great. Part I. Comprehending the external history of the Church. Chapter 1. Concerning the civil and religious state of the world at the birth of Christ. A great part of the world was become subject to the Roman Empire when Jesus Christ made his appearance upon earth. The remoter nations which had submitted to the yoke of this mighty empire were ruled either by Roman governors invested with temporary commissions or by their own princes and laws in subordination to the republic whose sovereignty was to be acknowledged and from which the conquered kings that were continued in their dominions derived their borrowed majesty. At the same time the Roman people and their venerable Senate, though they had not lost all shadow of liberty, were yet, in reality, reduced to a state of servile submission to Augustus Caesar, who by artifice, perfidy, and bloodshed, had proceeded to an enormous degree of power, and united in his own person the pompous titles of emperor, sovereign, pontiff, censor, tribune of the people, proconsul. In a word, all the great offices of the state. The Roman government, considered both with respect to its form and its laws, was certainly mild and equitable. But the injustice and avarice of the praetors and proconsuls, and the ambitious lust of conquest and dominion, which was the predominant passion of the Roman people, together with the rapacious proceedings of the publicans, by whom the taxes of the empire were levied, were the occasions of perpetual tumults and unsupportable grievances. And among the many evils that arose from thence, we justly reckon the formidable armies that were necessary to support these extortions in the provinces, and the civil wars which frequently broke out between the oppressed nations and their haughty conquerors. 3. It must, at the same time, be acknowledged that this supreme dominion of one people, or rather of one man, over so many kingdoms, was attended with many considerable advantages to mankind in general, and to the propagation and advancement of Christianity in particular. For, by the means of this almost universal empire, many nations, different in their language and in their manners, were united more intimately together in social intercourse. Hence a passage was opened in the remotest countries by the communications which the Romans formed between the conquered provinces. Hence also the nations, whose manners were savage and barbarous, were civilized by the laws and commerce of the Romans. And by this, in short, the benign influence of letters and philosophy was spread abroad in countries which had lain before under the darkest ignorance. All this contributed, no doubt, in a singular manner, to facilitate the progress of the gospel, and to crown the labors of its first ministers and heralds with success. IV. The Roman Empire, at the birth of Christ, was less agitated by wars and tumults than it had been for many years before. For, though I cannot assent to the opinion of those who maintain and that the temple of Janus was then shut and that wars and discords absolutely ceased throughout the world, yet it is certain that the period in which our Savior descended upon earth may be justly styled the Pacific Age if we compare it with the preceding times. And indeed, the tranquility that then reigned was necessary to enable the ministers of Christ to execute with success their sublime commission to the human race. V. The want of ancient records renders it impossible to say anything satisfactory or certain concerning the state of those nations who did not receive the Roman yoke. Nor indeed is their history essential to our present purpose. It is sufficient to observe, with respect to them, that those who inhabited the eastern regions were strangers to the sweets of liberty and groaned under the burden of an oppressive yoke. This, their softness and effeminacy, both in point of manners and bodily constitution, contributed to make them support with an unmanly patience. And even the religion they professed riveted their chains. On the contrary, the northern nations enjoyed, in their frozen dwellings, the blessings of sacred freedom, which their government, their religion, a robust and vigorous frame of body and spirit, derived from the inclemency and severity of their climate, all united to preserve and maintain. By all these nations lived in the practice of the most abominable superstitions. For though the notion of one supreme being was not entirely effaced in the human mind, but showed itself frequently, even through the darkness of the grossest idolatry, yet all nations, except that of the Jews, acknowledged a number of governing powers, whom they called gods, and one or more of which they supposed to preside over each particular province or people. They worshipped these fictitious deities with various rites. They considered them as widely different from each other in sex and power, in their nature, and also in their respective offices, and they appeased them by a multiplicity of ceremonies and offerings, in order to obtain their protection and favor. I. Every nation then had its respective gods, over which presided one more excellent than the rest. Yet in such a manner, that this supreme deity was himself controlled by the rigid empire of the fates, or what the philosophers called eternal necessity. The gods of the East were different from those of the Gauls, the Germans, and the other northern nations. The Grecian divinities differed widely from those of the Egyptians, who deified plants, animals, and a great variety of the productions both of nature and art. Each people also had their own particular manner of worshipping and appeasing their respective deities, entirely different from the sacred rites of other countries. In process of time, however, the Greeks and Romans grew as ambitious in their religious pretensions as in their political claims. They maintained that their gods, though under different names, were the objects of religious worship in all nations, and therefore they gave the names of their deities to those of other countries. This pretension, whether supported by ignorance or other means, introduced inexpressible darkness and perplexity into the history of the ancient superstitions, and has been also the occasion of innumerable errors in the writings of the learned. X. The deities of almost all nations were either ancient heroes, renowned for noble exploits and worthy deeds, or kings and generals who had founded empires, or women become illustrious by remarkable actions or useful inventions. The merit of these distinguished and eminent persons, contemplated by their posterity with an enthusiastic gratitude, was the reason of their being exalted to celestial honors. The natural world furnished another kind of deities that were added to these by some nations. And as the sun, moon, and stars shine forth with a luster superior to that of all other material beings, so it is certain that they particularly attracted the attention of mankind and received religious homage from almost all the nations of the world. From these beings of a nobler kind, idolatry descended into an enormous multiplication of inferior powers. So that in many countries, mountains, trees and rivers, the earth, the sea, and the winds, nay, even virtues, vices, and diseases, had their shrines attended by devout and zealous worshippers. X. These deities were honored with rites and sacrifices of various kinds, according to their respective nature and offices. The rites used in their worship were absurd and ridiculous, and frequently cruel and obscene. Most nations offered animals, and some proceeded to the enormity of human sacrifices. As to their prayers, they were void of piety and sense, both with respect to their matter and their form. Pontiffs, priests, and ministers, distributed into several classes, presided in this strange worship, and were appointed to prevent disorder in the performance of the sacred rites. This order, which was supposed to be distinguished by an immediate intercourse and friendship with the gods, abused their authority in the basest manner to deceive an ignorant and wretched people. The religious worship we have now been considering was confined to stated times and places. The statues and other representations of the gods were placed in the temples and supposed to be animated in an incomprehensible manner. For the votaries of these fictitious deities, however destitute they might be of reason in other respects, avoided carefully the imputation of worshipping inanimate beings, such as brass, wood, and stone, and therefore pretended that the divinity represented by the statue was really present in it if the dedication was duly and properly made. But, beside the public worship of the gods, to which all without exception were admitted, there were certain religious institutions and rites celebrated in secret by the Greeks and several Eastern nations, to which a very small number were allowed access. These were commonly called mysteries. And the persons who desired to be initiated therein were obliged previously to exhibit satisfactory proofs of their fidelity and patience by passing through various trials and ceremonies of the most disagreeable kind. The secret of these institutions was kept in the strictest manner, as the initiated could not reveal anything that passed in them without exposing their lives to the most imminent danger. And that is the reason why, at this time, we are so little acquainted with the true nature and the real design of these hidden rites. It is, however, well known that, in some of those mysteries, many things were transacted that were contrary both to real modesty and outward decency. And indeed, from the whole of the pagan rites, the intelligent few might easily learn that the divinities generally worshipped were rather men famous for their vices than distinguished by virtuous and worthy deeds. It is at least certain that this religion had not the least influence toward the exciting or nourishing solid and true virtue in the minds of men. For the gods and goddesses, to whom public homage was paid, exhibited to their worshippers rather examples of egregious crimes than of useful and illustrious virtues. The gods, moreover, were esteemed superior to men in power and immortality. But in everything else, they were considered as their equals. The priests were little solicitous to animate the people to a virtuous conduct either by their precepts or their example. Nay, they plainly enough declared that all that was essential to the true worship of the gods was contained only in the rites and institutions which the people had received by tradition from their ancestors. And as to what regarded the rewards of virtue and the punishment of vice after this present life, the general notions were partly uncertain, partly licentious, and often more proper to administer indulgence to vice than encouragement to virtue. Hence the wiser part of mankind, about the time of Christ's birth, looked upon this whole system of religion as a just object of ridicule and contempt. The consequences of this wretched theology were a universal corruption of manners, which discovered itself in the impunity of the most flagitious crimes. It is also well known that no public law prohibited the sports of the gladiators, the exercise of unnatural lusts, the licentiousness of divorce, the custom of exposing infants, and of procuring abortions, nor the frontless atrocity of consecrating publicly stews and brothels to certain divinities. Such as were not sunk in an unaccountable and brutish stupidity, perceived the deformity of these religious systems. To these the crafty priests addressed two considerations to prevent their incredulity and to dispel their doubts. The first was drawn from the miracles and prodigies which they pretended were daily wrought in the temples before the statues of the gods and the heroes that were placed there. And the second was deduced from oracles and divination, by which they maintained that the secrets of futurity were unfolded through the interposition of the gods. In both these points the cunning of the priests imposed miserably upon the ignorance of the people. And if the discerning few saw the cheat, they were obliged, from a regard to their own safety, to laugh with caution, since the priests were even ready to accuse, before a raging and superstitious multitude, those who discovered their religious frauds, as rebels against the majesty of the immortal gods. At the time of Christ's appearance upon earth, the religion of the Romans, as well as their arms, had extended itself through a great part of the world. This religion must be known to those who are acquainted with the Grecian superstitions. In some things, indeed, it differs from them. For the Romans, beside the institutions which Numa and others had invented with political views, added several Italic and Etrurian fictions to the Grecian fables, and gave also to the Egyptian deities a place among their own. In the provinces subjected to the Roman government, there arose a new kind of religion, formed by a mixture of the ancient rites of the conquered nations with those of the Romans. These nations who, before their subjection, had their own gods and their own particular religious institutions, were persuaded, by degrees, to admit into their worship a great number of the sacred rites and customs of their conquerors. The view of the Romans in this change was not only to confirm their authority by the powerful aid of religion, but also to abolish the inhuman rites which were performed by many of the barbarous nations who had received their yoke. And this change was effected partly by the prudence of the victors, partly by the levity of the vanquished, and by their ambition to please their new masters. When, from the sacred rites of the ancient Romans, we pass to a review of the other religions that prevailed in the world, we shall find that the most remarkable may be properly divided into two classes, of which the one will comprehend the religious systems which owe their existence to political views, and the other, those which seem to have been formed for military purposes. In the former class may be ranked the religions of most of the Eastern nations, especially of the Persians, Egyptians and Indians, which appear to have been solely calculated for the preservation of the state, the supporting of the royal authority and grandeur, the maintenance of public peace, and the advancement of civil virtues. Under the military class may be comprehended the religious system of the northern nations. Since all the traditions that we find among the Germans, the Britons, the Celts and the Goths concerning their divinities have a manifest tendency to excite and nourish fortitude and ferocity, an insensibility of danger, and a contempt of life. An attentive inquiry into the religions of these respective nations will abundantly verify what is here asserted. 6. None of these nations indeed ever arrived at such a degree of universal barbarity and ignorance as not to have some discerning men among them who were sensible of the extravagance of all these religions. But of these sagacious observers, some were destitute of the weight and authority that were necessary to remedy these overgrown evils. And others wanted the will to exert themselves in such a glorious cause. And the truth is, none of them had wisdom equal to such a solemn and arduous enterprise. This appears manifestly from the laborious but useless efforts of some of the Greek and Roman philosophers against the vulgar superstitions. These venerable sages delivered in their writings many sublime things concerning the nature of God and the duties incumbent upon men. They disputed with sagacity against the popular religion. But to all this they added such chimerical notions and such absurd subtleties of their own as may serve to convince us that it belongs to God alone and not to man to reveal the truth without any mixture of impurity or error. XX. About the time of Christ's appearance upon earth, there were two kinds of philosophy which prevailed among the civilized nations. One was the philosophy of the Greeks, adopted also by the Romans. And the other, that of the Orientals, which had a great number of votaries in Persia, Syria, Chaldea, Egypt, and even among the Jews. The former was distinguished by the simple title of philosophy. The latter was honored with the more pompous appellation of science or knowledge, since those who embraced this latter sect claimed to be the restorers of the knowledge of God, which was lost in the world. The followers of both these systems, in consequence of vehement disputes and dissensions about several points, subdivided themselves into a variety of sects. It is, however, to be observed that all the sects of the Oriental philosophy deduced their various tenets from one fundamental principle, which they held in common. Whereas the Greeks were much divided even about the first principles of science. XXI. Among the Grecian sects, there were some which declared openly against all religion. And others who, though they acknowledged a deity and admitted a religion, yet cast a cloud over the truth instead of exhibiting it in its genuine beauty and luster. Of the former kind were the Epicureans and academics. The Epicureans maintained that the world arose from chance. That the gods, whose existence they did not dare to deny, neither did nor could extend their providential care to human affairs. That the soul was mortal. That pleasure was to be regarded as the ultimate end of man. And that virtue was neither worthy of esteem nor choice, but with a view to its attainment. The academics asserted the impossibility of arriving at truth and held it uncertain whether the gods existed or not. Whether the soul was mortal or immortal. Whether virtue were preferable to vice or vice to virtue. These two sects, though they struck at the foundations of all religion, were the most numerous of all others at the birth of Christ and were particularly encouraged by the liberality of the rich and the protection of those in power. XXII. We observed in the preceding section that there was another kind of philosophy in which religion was admitted but which was, at the same time, deficient by the obscurity it cast upon truth. Under the philosophers of this class may be reckoned the Platonists, the Stoics, and the followers of Aristotle, whose subtle disputations concerning God, religion, and the social duties were of little solid use to mankind. The nature of God, as it is explained by Aristotle, is something like the principle that gives motion to a machine. It is a nature happy in the contemplation of itself and entirely regardless of human affairs. And such a divinity, who differs but little from the God of Epicurus, cannot reasonably be the object either of love or fear. With respect to the doctrine of this philosopher concerning the human soul, it is uncertain, to say no more, whether he believed its immortality or not. What then could be expected from such a philosophy? Could anything solid and satisfactory, in favor of piety and virtue, be hoped for from a system which excluded from the universe a divine providence and insinuated the mortality of the human soul? XXIII. The God of the Stoics has somewhat more majesty than the divinity of Aristotle. Nor is he represented by those philosophers as sitting above the starry heavens in a supine indolence and a perfect inattention to the affairs of the universe. Yet he is described as a corporeal being, united to matter by a necessary connection, and subject to the determinations of an immutable fate, so that neither rewards nor punishments can properly proceed from him. The learned also know that, in the philosophy of this sect, the existence of the soul was confined to a certain period of time. Now it is manifest that these tenets remove, at once, the strongest motives to virtue and the most powerful restraints upon vice. And, therefore, the Stoical system may be considered as a body of specious and pompous doctrine, but, at the same time, as a body without nerves or any principles of consistence and vigor. XXIV. Plato is generally looked upon as superior to all the other philosophers in wisdom. And this eminent rank does not seem to have been undeservedly conferred upon him. He taught that the universe was governed by a being, glorious in power and wisdom, and possessed of a perfect liberty and independence. He extended also the views of mortals beyond the grave and showed them, in futurity, prospects adapted to excite their hopes and to work upon their fears. His doctrine, however, beside the weakness of the foundations on which it rests and the obscurity with which it is often expressed, has likewise many other considerable defects. It represents the supreme creator of the world as destitute of many perfections and confined to a certain determinate portion of space. Its decisions, with respect to the soul and demons, are too much adapted to beget and nourish superstition. Nor will the moral philosophy of Plato appear worthy of such a high degree of admiration if we attentively examine and compare together its various parts and reduce them to their principles. XXV. As then, in these different sects, there were many things maintained that were highly unreasonable and absurd. And as a contentious spirit of opposition and dispute prevailed among them all. Certain men of true discernment and of moderate characters were of opinion that none of these sects were to be adhered to in all matters, but that it was rather wise to choose and extract out of each of them such tenets and doctrines as were good and reasonable, and to abandon and reject the rest. This gave rise to a new form of philosophy in Egypt, and principally at Alexandria, which was called the Eclectic, whose founder, according to some, was Potamon, an Alexandrian, though this opinion is not without its difficulties. It appears manifestly from the testimony of Philo the Jew, who was himself one of the sect, that this philosophy was in a flourishing state at Alexandria when our Savior was upon the earth. The eclectics held Plato in the highest esteem, though they made no scruple to join with his doctrines, whatever they thought conformable to reason in the tenets and opinions of the other philosophers. XXVI. The attentive reader will easily conclude, from the short view that we have here given of the miserable state of the world at the birth of Christ, that mankind, in this period of darkness and corruption, stood highly in need of some divine teacher to convey to the mind true and certain principles of religion and wisdom, and to recall wandering mortals to the sublime paths of piety and virtue. The consideration of this wretched condition of mankind will be also singularly useful to those who are not sufficiently acquainted with the advantages, the comforts and the support which the sublime doctrines of Christianity are so proper to administer in every state, relation, and circumstance of life. Chapter 2. Concerning the civil and religious state of the Jewish nation at the birth of Christ. I. The state of the Jews was not much better than that of the other nations at the time of Christ's appearance in the world. They were governed by Herod, who was himself a tributary to the Roman people. This prince was surnamed the Great, surely from no other circumstance than the greatness of his vices, and his government was a yoke of the most vexatious and oppressive kind. By a cruel, suspicious, and overbearing temper, he drew upon himself the aversion of all, not excepting those who lived upon his bounty. By a mad luxury and an affectation of magnificence far above his fortune, together with the most profuse and immoderate largesses, he exhausted the treasures of that miserable nation. Under his administration, and by his means, the Roman luxury was received in Palestine, accompanied with the worst vices of that licentious people. In a word, Judea, governed by Herod, groaned under all that corruption, which might be expected from the authority and the example of a prince, who, though a Jew in outward profession, was, in point of morals and practice, a contumer of all laws human and divine. Who after the death of this tyrant, the Romans divided the government of Palestine between his sons. In this division the one half of Judea was given to Archelaus, with the title of Ethnarch. And the other was divided between his two brothers, Antipas and Philip. Archelaus was a corrupt and wicked prince, and followed the example of his father's crimes in such a manner, that the Jews, grown weary of his iniquitous administration, laid their complaints and grievances before Augustus, who delivered them from their oppressor, by banishing him from his dominions, about 10 years after the death of Herod the Great. The kingdom of this dethroned prince was reduced to the form of a province and added to the jurisdiction of the governor of Syria, to the great detriment of the Jews, whose heaviest calamities were owing to this change, and whose final destruction was its undoubted effect in the appointment of providence. However severe the authority was, which the Romans exercised over the Jews, yet it did not extend to the entire suppression of all their civil and religious privileges. The Jews were, in some measure, governed by their own laws, and they were permitted the enjoyment of the religion they had received from the glorious founder of their church and state. The administration of religious ceremonies was committed, as before, to the high priest and to the Sanhedrin. To the former of whom the order of the priests and Levites was in the usual subordination. And the form of outward worship, except in a very few points, had suffered no visible change. But, on the other hand, it is impossible to express the inquietude and disgust, the calamities and vexations which this unhappy nation suffered from the presence of the Romans, whom their religion obliged them to look upon as a polluted and idolatrous people, and in a more particular manner, from the avarice and cruelty of the praetors, and the frauds and extortions of the publicans. So that all things considered, their condition, who lived under the government of the other sons of Herod, was much more supportable than the state of those who were immediately subject to the Roman jurisdiction. IV. It was not, however, from the Romans alone that the calamities of this miserable people proceeded. Their own rulers multiplied their vexations and hindered them from enjoying any little comforts that were left to them by the Roman magistrates. The leaders of the people and the chief priests were, according to the account of Josephus, profligate wretches who had purchased their places by bribes or by acts of iniquity and who maintained their ill-acquired authority by the most flagitious and abominable crimes. The subordinate and inferior members were infected with the corruption of the head. The priests and those who possessed any shadow of authority were become dissolute and abandoned to the highest degree. While the multitude, set on by these corrupt examples, ran headlong into every sort of iniquity, and by their endless additions, robberies and extortions, armed against them both the justice of God and the vengeance of men. Religion had not a better fate among the learned doctors, who vaunted their profound knowledge of the law, and their deep science in spiritual and divine things, were constantly showing their fallibility and their ignorance by their religious differences, and were divided into a great variety of sects. Of these sects 3 have, in a great measure, eclipsed the rest, both by the number of their adherents, and also by the weight and authority which they acquired. These were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. These 3 illustrious sects agreed in the fundamental principles of the Jewish religion, while at the same time, they were involved in endless disputes upon points of the highest importance, and about matters in which the salvation of mankind was directly concerned. And their controversies could not but be highly detrimental to the rude and illiterate multitude, as everyone must easily perceive. It may not be improper to mention here some of the principal matters that were debated among these famous sects. One of the main points of controversy was whether the written law alone was of divine authority. The Pharisees added to this law another, which had been received by oral tradition. This the Sadducees and Essenes rejected as of no authority, and adhered to the written law as the only divine rule of obedience. They differed also in their opinions concerning the true sense of the law. For, while the Pharisees attributed to the sacred text a double sense, one of which was obvious, regarding only the words, and another mysterious, relating to the intimate nature of the things expressed. And while the Sadducees maintained that nothing further was delivered by the law than that which was contained in the signification of the words, the Essenes, at least the greatest part of that sect, entertained an opinion different from both of these. They asserted, in their jargon, that the words of the law were absolutely void of all power, and that the things expressed by them were the images of holy and celestial objects. These litigious subtleties and unintelligible wranglings about the nature and sense of the divine word were succeeded by a controversy of the greatest moment concerning the rewards and punishments of the law, particularly with respect to their extent. The Pharisees were of opinion that these rewards and punishments extended both to the soul and body, and that their duration was prolonged beyond the limits of this transitory state. The Sadducees assigned to them the same period that concludes this mortal life. The Essenes differed from both, and maintained that future rewards and punishments extended to the soul alone, and not to the body, which they considered as a mass of malignant matter, and as the prison of the immortal spirit.